What are the best books on madness ever written? Books that show the descent into madness in fine and emotional detail. Well, today I'm going to sling some classic and contemporary heat your way, because here on Right Conscious, I talk about the best books and authors of all time. And more importantly, I help you activate so that we can create a literary renaissance, because we just don't need more writers. We need more awesome readers like you who are going to continue to buy books, and support literature. And so if you are interested in that mission and what I am doing here, then please consider subscribing, leaving a comment, liking the video, and helping me reach the masses so I can wake them up. And so here we go, everyone. What's the first book I'm going to talk about? Guys, I'm a lit bro at heart. I may be the king of lit bro soon if I keep up this pace of 1 hour video a day. And so I would love to talk about so many different books first, but oh my God, I got an itchy neck right now. And what is behind me? The Brothers Karamazov. Oh my God, wrong way. By Dostoevsky. And you guys already know that this has to be on the list. The amount of hysterics, maddening decisions, and multiple descents into madness throughout this novel are insane. It makes me literally want to go back and live in the time that this is all taking place in Russia, because I would just love to just act and like have a breakdown and be a holy fool and go to my work and be like, Johnny, you fucking suck at teaching. You are the worst English teacher ever. You know, that's my neighbor, Johnny. And then tell all the kids in some drunken rage, your parents all hate you. I'm just an overly literate babysitter. I would love to do that every once in a while. Like it seemed like seemingly everyone in this novel does. I would love every one of my interactions to have flourishes and like all of that. But seriously though, so the Brothers Karamazov isn't the exact model of madness and the descent into it, as we'll see like in House of Leaves or The Bell Jar or One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest or whatever. And that's because the characters aren't necessarily just going mad, and it's not just a verb. They are grappling with the metaphysical condition of madness itself. They are thinking about God and freedom and justice and guilt and sensuality and all this stuff. And so I am going to try to prevent saying any major spoilers throughout this video. Obviously, I'm going to have to talk about the plot of these books, but you shouldn't be worried that I'm going to give away the entire cake. And if I do, then I will try to make sure to tell you. So the Brothers Karamazov is about 3 brothers and their crazy dad, who's basically just descended into madness his entire life. And so the first brother that we are going to talk about is Ivan Karamazov. And he is a rationalist. He is an atheist, a philosopher, is into apologetics and arguing about axioms related to God. And he basically represents our arrogance while trying to make sense of the suffering of life and all the evil in the world and the suffering of children and all these things. And so his descent into madness begins because he refuses to forgive reality. And so this is actually one of the most important things to talk about in terms of religion, spirituality, madness, is that most people, one of the easiest ways, I should say, to go mad, to have a terrible life, is to have a terrible relationship with reality, honestly. And if you are an atheist that's generally pessimistic, I have never met one of them that is a happy, individuated, wholesome person in my entire life. And I've probably met near 1,000. I've never looked at a pessimistic atheist and wanted anything to do with them or wanted to like be in their shoes or felt any sense of like, wow, look at this guy. Even if we were highly successful or, had the hot wife or were doing whatever. And that's because they have a fractured relationship with reality, because there are different models of viewing reality. On this program, I talk about logic bros all the time, because objectivity, using logic, is just one way to view reality. And it's actually the easiest way to do it, especially for men. We've all been there before. We sat there and figured out all the axioms and figured out all these arguments that all the dumb people didn't understand. And you could go on with that forever. You could view reality through logic forever. But actually, the big solutions in life a lot of the time come from subjective models that could be religious or spiritual or whatever. Like there are a lot of other models other than just an objective view of reality. For instance, I talk about on this channel all the time that I objectively tried for 2 years to become a good booktuber. I did all the videos the right way. I used to edit the videos more, did this and that. And it wasn't until I took a subjective look at the entire picture and started doing odd things, uncanny things, things that would make no logical sense, that I became successful. The same goes with my art. I would never have met my wife if I was looking at life through a logical lens. I would not have the happiness and the joy I have. I would literally have nothing if all I brought to the table was the same logic bro mentality I had as a young teenager, even until 18 years old. But I know countless men out there, mostly men, who still bring that to their entire life. Literally, it's insane. It's so crazy. I mean, I deal with them all the time in the comment sections, just pure logic bros. But they don't realize that Dostoevsky already wrote about them. Because if you have an objective view of reality, then you don't have a relationship with reality at all. You just have a relationship with some weird codified system of logic within your head that is less strong than you can think and is way more limited than you can imagine. And it's sad, but I have found that reality works the best for me when I don't push too hard and don't get pulled too hard. I don't know what it is. I do believe that God is real. I don't exactly have the exact answer of what that is. But I would say, even if you're a Christian or whatever, that God doesn't want you to be a pushover. I've met weird people before. I don't know if they're just trying to use it, but I've met people before, the divine spirit, God, whether in spirituality or in Christianity, who literally take no action in their life because they feel like they are this total vessel of God. But they are the type of people, and I know men and women, to get into abusive relationships, bad financial hardship, and always have all these problems. Because at some point in life, we have free will for a reason. We can take action and exert our force and our logic or our subjective divergent thinking or whatever strategically. But I also know people who try to control the world too much, who try to never let life or their emotions make any of their decisions. And the best exercise to do this, and a really good way to actually prevent madness or problems in your future, is write down a list of the 5 worst moments of your life. Not just the worst moments, but like the worst times in your life. And then write about the 5 best ones. And then compare and contrast them and look at the different mentalities. For instance, the worst times in my life are when I was being too intelligent, too headstrong, too unwilling to let myself access my emotions. An easy story of this was I was really into in high school. I was into track and field and cross country. I was training a ton, trying to be really good. My sophomore year, at the end of it on the track, I ran a sub 16 5K, which isn't the greatest time in the world. But as a sophomore, I was like, dude, this means I could probably go sub 15 later on. I was like, dude, I have all these big goals. But then during that time, I was viewing my entire world rationally. How I trained, how I slept, everything I did was a pure calculation of logic. But it wasn't just on the field. And in sports, I was doing that. It was also in my personal life. I viewed women that way also, that if I could just manipulate them and do whatever I wanted to them. And so lo and behold, through pure rationality and manipulation, I convinced some girl who I shouldn't have been with, if I was being authentic, to date me. And so as people who date do, we made out. And this was like in August before my junior year. And I got mononucleosis from this girl and was sick for like 2 months straight. Like the worst sickness I've ever had. It affected me really bad. And my entire cross country season was ruined. All the training I had done to build up for it in the summer at high altitude, gone. But it didn't change. I just doubled down on the logic and it led to this crazy series of events. But every other time in my life where something went terribly wrong and a big dream that I really wanted to accomplish failed, whether that was bad relationships or all this stuff, it was when I was trying to force reality, trying to force things way too much. All the best moments in my life are when I just let things flow and I'm in this nice symbiotic relationship with reality itself. Like I said, it's a really fun exercise to do. I do it with my students all the time, and almost all of them find similar results. Obviously, there are outlier events, but it's really interesting Because tragic events sometimes happen. Sometimes you can just be driving and get hit and you're paralyzed, and that sucks. And that's not really what that's not what we're talking about here. But the road to me getting mono was a long and arduous one with many bad decisions. And that's just like the PG story. I'm not going to tell the R-rated stories of some, stories that involve death and just crazy stuff. But funny enough, my friends who died early, died before they were 21. I had 2 or 3 of them, all were in a very logical, forceful mentality in their life. My friend Russ thought he could defy nature and was killed in a backcountry skiing accident because of bad planning or bad decision making. My friend Colton thought that he was the master of drugs. He had the LSD tattoo, on his arm of the, compounds or whatever. He had everything correct. One mistake and he was the most confident dude. One mistake, overdose, dead. So Dostoevsky through Ivan is trying to show us how madness will happen to anyone who takes the mind too far without having a soul element to it. And this is why so many intellectuals, so many academics, so many even people throughout history have done so many terrible things, because they're not dumb people. Like they're on paper somewhat smart, but they got lost in this crazy political madness or psychological hole because of their mind. And we're going to talk about this kind of later on, but it's going to be one of the main reoccurring themes. And I think that Ivan in this is like just such a perfect example of this. And speaking of the brothers Karamazov, we are going to be discussing this novel Saturday at the Right Conscious Book Club, which is the most active book club in the world. We read anywhere from 6 to 10 novels every single month, discuss them, and I tried to make deep dive content into the books that we read over on Substack. So the book club is located on Substack, but also over on Substack. If you join, you will get access to all my literature and writing courses, my backlog of content that is easily over 50 hours of deep dives that I feel are some of my best content. You would get access to my writing, my podcast, and so much more. Live streams that only happen on Substack. And so if you guys want to support this channel and help me fulfill my small slice of creating a literary renaissance, your support would mean the world to me, whether it's free or paid. I have free content over on Substack that I try to get out. And if you go back through the archive, you will find a ton of free content. And so if you guys want to see what it looks like, here it is. I have a ton of new content always coming out. For instance, we are reading Infinite Jest right now again for the second time, and I'm releasing my Infinite Jest course videos every single month. If you guys want to go look, I have the book club schedule up for the next 3 months, and October schedule is going to be dropping soon so that you guys can prepare. And so even if you don't want to support me, Substack is where the best readers and writers in the world are. And so if you want to help kick off a literary renaissance, then you need to be supporting active writers over there, even just by liking their stuff. You have no idea how much it means to small writers and even someone like me when you go like one of their posts and leave a positive comment. It will drive someone to not sit and look at their phone and rather, on a hard day, write for 3 hours. And so even if you don't know what you can do and you have no money, you can still help people more than you can imagine while you are at work, instead of wasting time on Instagram or something like that. And so thank you guys for listening, and let's hop back to the video. And so next in the brothers Karamazov, we have a character that descends into madness because of his desire, because of his sensuality, and his name is Dmitri. And this is this weird type of desire that many people go mad who have a moral conscience. But because they have this weird energy within, in this text, they call it sensuality. Because they have this weird desire and love of life within them and need for life, sometimes that can take you over the edge too. Because sometimes it's really hard to balance between your instincts and what you want to do and your conscience. Because what if you have a really good conscience, right? But you're genetically just kind of hardwired to be this hard-charging, wild person. How do you grapple with that? And, that's what's happening here. And that has resulted in many people descending into madness. That has resulted in many people becoming addicts, that they have this sensual side to them, or they have this instinct that draws them into maybe negative situations. And then they have an open-minded heart that coincides with that perfectly. Because most addicts aren't just mindless individuals. Like maybe the fent walker at the end of the road, who's homeless and gone all the way is, but most addicts are actually more emotionally open people even before they got on drugs than the average person. And that's how they got into it. They are fantasy addicts. And so that's what Dimitri kind of represents, is the madness of passion and guilt in the story. And then at the end, we have a character named Alyosha, if I'm saying his name correctly. And his madness isn't a normal type of madness, because when we think of madness, we think of Jack Nicholson in The Shining. Here's Johnny. Like, that's what we think of. But some of the most mad people in the world are people who've embodied Christ consciousness, who've embodied the path of karma yoga. Think about it. How mad must you be to have unconditional love in this crazy world? And my life has been decent. You know, like I said, I've had some crazy shit happen to me. You've probably are very similar. But imagine if you are the innocent brother in a terrible family, and you've had a crazy life, but you still have a resolute view toward reality. You still have this untethered love. That's crazy. That's also madness. Positive form though, and one that we've celebrated all throughout time. I could go deeper into other characters, but this novel, I mean, like I said, there's at least 40 people in here that are just wacko. And so I really do recommend this novel to everybody. And so moving on and continuing my lit broness, we are just going to reach down in the stack and get, of course, Infinite Jest by David Foster Wallace. And Infinite Jest, when it comes to mental health, is absolutely underrated, because the entire novel is dealing with crazy people and family trauma. Everyone, and I mean everyone in this novel, is screwed up. The novel starts with our protagonist, Halin Condenza, who's at an interview to get a full ride scholarship at the University of Arizona in Tucson, where I'm at right now, and he can't speak. They're asking him, hey, why do you want to come here? Blah, 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 explain this. And he just is sitting there and he cannot speak. And the novel partially is about what happened to him. The novel also features hundreds of pages on addiction and on addicts. That is some of the best writing ever on addiction, because the descent into addiction is one of madness, not just because drugs make you do crazy things, but not being on drugs makes you do crazy things. We will see countless characters try to commit suicide, kill people, kill animals, and do anything they can to get more drugs or stay off drugs. And for those who have read this, tell me right now in the comments who isn't crazy. Avril, Jim and Condenza, Jim's entire family, Oren, Hal, Joelle, Gately, Kate, Canarity, Marathe, Steepley, all of them are literally insane. They've lost it. And Wallace isn't just writing about these people because they're fun to talk about. He's trying to tell us something. He's trying to tell us that this new world that we are living in, with technology, drugs, entertainment, sports, that's what's making us mad. That's what's creating the mental health problems. And he was a prophet in this regard. And so let's talk about really fast the different facets that Wallace explores. So first and foremost, Wallace talks about technology and entertainment. Infinite Jest is a movie that the protagonist's father, Jim and Condenza, made. And anyone who watches it becomes comatose, can no longer function in reality. And can you imagine the terrorist potential of something like that? But then also the appeal to all the edgelords, all the risk takers out there who would want to see what it was about. It would be absolutely destructive. But Wallace is trying to make an overarching metaphor about what technology is eventually going to do to us, because he predicted the rise of FaceTime and how FaceTime was going to ruin relationships. He predicted how much cell phones were going to fragment and separate us. He predicted streaming services like Netflix and basically everything. And it wasn't because he was some prophet. Anyone back in the 90s who was thinking about it could see where things were going. But instead of just talking about it like Neil Postman and Technopoly or whatever, like a Logic Bro, he obviously turns it into a story and shows us through Jim Incandenza and his sons and everyone affected by technology how terrible it is. Another facet, and I should say that multiple characters in the book go crazy because of film and their obsession with technology. Next, we have addiction. And Wallace was an addict himself. He went to AA meetings, NA meetings, or whatever meeting he could find for over a decade until his death. And I love people that make fun of David Foster Wallace for killing himself and saying, why would I take advice from someone that killed himself? Well, he got put on a prescription drug in his sophomore year in college that was an antidepressant. And when he tried to get off of it 2.5 decades later, it absolutely shattered him and threw him into this crazy state of depression. And he couldn't get back on the drug or any drug, and nothing could help him. allegedly. And so that's more of a failure of the pharmaceutical industry and the people around him not to recognize that he needed 24-hour surveillance until he got better. And so Wallace was an alcoholic. He was addicted to weed. He would watch 16 hours of television a day at times for periods of his life. And so a lot of the time, Wallace doesn't write like a first-person point of view. This novel mostly takes place in the third person with some occasional first-person point of view. He writes about addiction from the third person, mostly in a more informative way, in kind of this maximalist approach, and gives you this catalog of feelings. And by doing it, Wallace, once again, was prophetic in predicting things like weed addiction. You know, if you go talk to teenagers or even talk to a lot of bros still online, people say, weed's not addictive. But if you look at all the people who try to quit weed and never are able to, you know, I've had a buddy who's tried to quit weed for the past 15 years, and he would never say that he's an addict, but he's just been continuing to smoke every single day. And Wallace gives examples of characters who are addicted to weed, because you can become addicted to anything. You right now are most likely addicted to food, and bad food that's not doing anything for you as a means of regulating your stress. Plus probably many other things that aren't like hardcore heroin in the arm type addictions, but are addictions nonetheless. A lot of you guys are addicted to caffeine out there. And if you don't believe me, try to eat clean for a year. Try not to drink caffeine for a year. Try not to look at porn or masturbate for a year. And so Wallace explores a lot of these soft addictions. I mean, among the hard addictions too, but weed, sex, psychedelics, and all these things, and shows that when it's combined with the wrong person, it can be disastrous. And the addiction side of the novel really discusses paralysis. But paralysis is actually the main theme of the novel, and actually one of the components of madness, because when we think of someone being mad, we maybe think that they are manic, and we're thinking there's a descent, and they're like, oh my God. But a lot of the time, madness or mental health problems are people who are overly passive and maybe have manic episodes and can't function anymore, but they've become paralyzed and no longer can engage in activities that can heal them. They can no longer hang out with friends or run errands or play sports, read, write, or whatever. And Wallace argues that a lot of this paralysis actually comes from overthinking, which is so smart, because he talks about how almost every single addict is an overthinker, because addicts are addicted to story, to fantasy, to this other world, so much so they'll let that world totally consume them. What happens when you are addicted to technology? You are paralyzed. You are comatose. And this entire novel just features characters who are obsessed to the point of not achieving, but becoming paralyzed and thus failing at life. And so the scope and the random tangents and the philosophical meanderings, the footnotes, everything about this is great. And then the last aspect of the novel is the sports. There is an academy that Wallace, a tennis academy, I should say, that Wallace follows, called the Enfield Tennis Academy. That is a prep school for young men and women trying to become professional tennis players. And once again, he shows that obsession over sports and all of these things usually lead to dire outcomes and usually lead people to other addictions. Like the obsession on tennis is so stressful because to become a high-level tennis player, you have to dedicate everything, that many of the characters fall into sex addictions, drug addictions, or just outright implode. And so there is so much in this novel about madness that I think deserves exploring. And another big theme of this is family trauma, because where does madness come from? Well, we could say that it's genetic, and I think that partially it is sometimes, but most of the time it's from your environment and how you were raised. And there are at least 100 pages in this novel exploring how your family, which you may think is nice and not overtly bad, actually is the cause of most of your problems. And so Infinite Jest has to be on this list. So next on the list, we have The Shining by Stephen King. And I'm not scared to talk about Stephen King because I believe the main problem with Stephen King is that he just writes too fast. And as he has gotten older, and who am I to sit and criticize, him from the cheap seats? But from what I could tell, and I think many people would agree, he's had a lot of duds. But if you've read some of his books, and I used to read a lot because my dad and I would kind of read them together, there are some really good Stephen King novels out there. And I think a lot of the time that, like, when you were on drugs, like Stephen King was on drugs, and you are younger, and if you keep a writing routine and you're talented and have already put the work in before you got on drugs, you could produce some pretty good stuff. And then occasionally some really bad stuff. But now that he's older, off drugs, seemingly only focused on politics a lot of the time, I haven't seen the spark, but who knows? So down below, for those who have seen the movie and read the book, which one do you think is better? Because I actually like the book better than the movie, which is usually the case, but for a Stanley Kubrick movie, for instance, I read, I don't think it's over here right now, Paths of Glory, which was one of Kubrick's first movies, which was a book, and the movie is better than the book. And so I enjoy this novel because I feel like King sets up, a compelling character with Jack Torrance. You know, I don't know if this just is me projecting right now, but he's a failed writer. He's a failed teacher. He's a failed husband. He's hurt his kid. And all of us have failures in life. All of us have these resentments. And sometimes you just get really unlucky and things just don't work out in your favor. And it's sad. And usually if you stay persistent, you can move through those times into a better reality, blah, blah, blah. But I know people who, for whatever reason, have a half cup full mentality, or maybe they had a hard childhood. I've been through some hard times in my life and I've tried to persevere and I've been to the brink, but I've never necessarily had one of these descents into madness. And this is, I think, typical of American men and just men in general, as we've seen in the novels. The brothers Karamazov dealt with alcoholism. Infinite Jest had a father figure who was an alcoholic who died a tragic death. It seems to be a general trope in literature to use because many of us have witnessed it. We've witnessed our dad, drinking 15 beers a night or on the weekend or something and just being loaded. I have a buddy from high school, and when I used to go over to his house, his dad was this regimented dude, really hardcore, really kind of an asshole toward his kids for no real reason. But he would get loaded on the weekends and it could just go any direction. He'd be doing karaoke with Johnny Cash. He could be screaming at his wife or his kids. He could be hugging you. He could be crying. He could be playing music. He played the bass. If you went over there on Saturday night, who knows what could happen? And so when self-loathing, though, combines with alcoholism, things can get really, really bad. It's actually one of the more dangerous archetypes out there. And now, actually, I think this type of messaging and contemplation is more important than ever because this generation of boomers that is getting older and gave birth to many of these millennials and even some of the Gen Zers, they are not emotionally attuned a lot of the time. Their parents were pretty harsh toward them and they were born into kind of this split world, and we don't need to really get into the boomer mentality very much. But many millennials and Gen Zers out there don't really feel like they have emotional support from their parents. Like they have maybe a general support. And then on top of that, they have the burden of trying to stay in their class financially. Like my dad was a professor and my mom worked. And my dad did private consulting and all this other stuff for statistical forecasting. And hopefully one day with this channel and everything I'm doing, I will eventually, reach the level of success that they had and be able to buy a house and do all of this. But almost none of my friends have surpassed their parents or are going to unless they just totally pivot the direction they're going on. And there is a ton of resentment because of that. And for the hardworking types or my type A friend types who follow the rules and got a degree in something practical, medical field, business, computer science, they're not doing too bad. They're okay with it. But I have other friends who are more the dreamer types, who in times past would have eventually straightened up, got a decent job, been able to find a good wife, get a house, and move into the world. And in history, not all of them were able to do that. But now almost all of my friends who are in that archetype are working kind of crappy to mid-level jobs. They don't like their life. They are alcoholics. And there's this overarching resentment that they can't do X, Y, or Z, that they can't afford to go and live on the land, that they can't do this, they can't do that. They want to do van life, but they can't even get enough money to get a van. Like all these kind of excuses, but nonetheless, it's real. And so what they fill that void with is alcohol. And I actually knew a guy from high school once again who fit this archetype perfectly. And he was dating another girl out of high school. They were like high school sweethearts. And, I lost contact with them, but I heard from someone else that he had gone to jail for a while because he had brutally beat her up. apparently just to see that he could do it. And he'd been doing it for a while and getting away with it. And then eventually like reached the point where it was like an extreme case. And once I talked to this person who was like, used to be friends with him before all this happened, they're like, yeah, he was just this resentful alcoholic. And it was crazy because in high school, he was generally a good dude, a kind guy, a happy guy. I remember one time him and I, and this is before portable chargers and all that was a big deal. We got stuck at the Aliante Casino in Las Vegas and had to walk miles home together because we felt too prideful to call for help. We're like, oh, okay, we'll just walk. And so much of Jack's problems in The Shining, his descent into madness, is from alcoholism. It's what compounds it all. One thing that I like that King forces in this novel is this idea of cabin fever, because the Overlook Hotel, which funny enough, in the movie, it's depicted as Timberline Lodge in Oregon, where I used to work as a ski instructor. It serves as this isolation chamber. They're cut off in the winter snow. It's supposed to be in Colorado. And eventually it creates a closed system, which when you look at madness, that's what happens a lot of the time. You no longer, it's either too many open loops and you've gone like too far into like expansive free association, or you have started to engage in just closing all the loops. And that's what starts to happen. And that's when the demons start to manifest. That's what happened to Ivan and the brothers Karamazov. His mind becomes closed and thus he starts having these hallucinations. Or in something like Hamlet, he has this closed loop that eventually causes madness. So you could say that Shakespeare does this all of the time, like in Macbeth and all these other stories, that many of the characters go on this inward journey and then start hallucinating, Banquo's ghost or whatever. And so King is really just kind of playing on many old themes, but making them modern, which is awesome. And King does a good job of making the hotel basically a metaphor. The locked rooms are guilt, resentment, memory. It almost feels like Yukio Mishima's Temple of the Golden Pavilion, that there is this structure, this aesthetic beauty. The structure itself is what's causing the madness and the terror within, which is really smart. Because is that really the case? No, but being able to divert from the character and not make it into a stream of consciousness mess or whatever, which we'll get into later, which is somewhat harder to do, is a good idea, especially if you want to kind of continue to tell a good story. Because we'll talk about kind of these meandering 1,000 pages descents into madness in a second, but how effective are those for the common reader? I've known a ton of people who have read this book and seen the movie. And so last but not least, like many descents into madness, unless you're doing this singular character that's just going on a rant, like William Gass's The Tunnel or something like that, or some Virginia Woolf novel or whatever, which really isn't a descent into madness, but you have to have anchors or reference to be watching this so it makes it actually impactful. And so Wendy, Jack's wife, even before anything crazy starts to happen, is just constantly afraid of when he's going to do something crazy again. And I like how Danny, the child in the story, is basically split between worlds, able to see things, but also scared. Like, it's all really good writing by King. And, watching Danny, have these problems, and you're like, dude, is this genetic? Is he like his father? Or is this just a response to trauma? Really just pushes this idea of madness even further. And so I do recommend The Shining by Stephen King. If you are just trying to read kind of a page turner, that's fun. That's a good story that deals with mental health issues. And if you haven't read it yet, I honestly would recommend it, because then you could watch the awesome movie counterpart and have maybe a more refined opinion on King, other than just saying that he's a hack and he sucks. Because at times he is, but that's not the whole picture. So next we have another more mainstream novel that isn't maybe the postmodern frenzy that you guys want from this list. Don't worry, I will deliver some of those later. But I want to continue talking about and shining light on authors that I don't normally cover, because if you watch, hopefully, all of these videos I'm doing, these top 10 videos, I sometimes, repeat one or two books I've done before, but I try to do original selections every single video, so that by the end, I will have 1,000 novel recommendations for you guys, and you can kind of pick where you want to go. Because just an FYI, but one of the best things I've done is take copious notes on all the novels I read. So I just released a video over on my Substack on how I read over 200 books per year and how I've basically been doing that for the past 13 or 14 years. And it's not always just about reading a lot of books, but being able to remember them. And so something I've done since I was like 20 for the past 12 years is really focus on note taking and, writing a summary of the book when I'm done and my feelings and some of my favorite quotes and writing in the margins and doing a couple other things, because I remember when I was like 18 and 19 and reading, I was forgetting a lot of the stuff I was reading like a year later. I was like, what happened in that? And I couldn't explain it very well. And so a lot of the stuff I say about these novels, because I do all this online, I can just pull up all of my old notes and it just kind of reminds me how I felt when I read it and then some of my thoughts. And then all I have to do is just expand for these segments. And so just reading and not keeping a memory of it other than in your memory, unless you are some photographic genius, is kind of a bad idea. And so I read this back in some women crime writers class at university, which was an odd class. It's actually where I didn't meet my wife, but where my wife and I basically kicked our relationship off. I had known her and spoken to her a couple other times at other various events and at her job, but then we had that class together and boom, explosions, everybody. And here we are 6 years later. She was the only person in there who had a brain that wasn't just regimented. Many people go to university just to get a job at the end because they were told to by their parents, or to go get, some PhD. And so all those people are usually artistically and creatively restrained. Like when it was my turn to talk in some of these classes that were discussion based, I would just say the craziest things. And she would do the same thing. And so that's how we connected, because I remember connecting German idealism to the novel Frankenstein, and everyone in the class was sneering at my opinion. And she was just smiling at me and nodding her head. I was like, boom, I'm going to make sure to talk to you. You are the one, Jesus Christ. So when I first read this felt to me kind of like a Neil Gaiman novel that wasn't Neil Gaiman, that allowed itself to maybe go a little bit darker than usual, because many of Neil Gaiman's, and maybe because Neil got canceled, he can finally start writing novels again, because I don't feel like since he wrote like a Nazi Boys or whatever it's called, Nazi Boys or whatever it's called, that he's written an actual novel for adults since the mid 2000s. So maybe we'll get one. And so this novel is about a girl named Mary that's living with her sister and her uncle in this house. And it's basically decaying. And Mary acts like a child. And speaking of family trauma, this is the descent into madness trope. Most of her family was poisoned at a dinner. And so in this novel, madness takes on a different form. It takes on more of like a pagan magical realism form, but that isn't necessarily like regimented, because if someone is out there and they have a system, let's say they are a Native American or they're a shaman or whatever, and they're putting up trinkets or doing things, I'm not going to judge them. If they have a system behind it and, they feel like, this is doing something and it has some tradition, whatever. Like you're just following in those footsteps. And for whatever reason, maybe rightfully so, you feel like this works, just like Christians praying like, okay, cool. But when someone is just doing things randomly and like putting up trinkets or doing things, or like sometimes when Christians like start acting like really crazy, like out of nowhere, which I've seen before, or like, I'm just kind of like, okay, this is no longer religious. This is like a compulsion, which is actually very interesting, because when I see people who do that, like I've known a lot of spiritual women who like are always like doing things that have no basis in anything except their intuition. But what's cool is that it's actually a defense mechanism against a psychological breakdown. It's actually a way for them to create and interact with reality, because a lot of the time they never got some of that early individuation that was important. And that's kind of one of the sad things about our society too, that we could speak about right now really fast, is that many people descend into madness because we no longer have any rites of passage, no longer really any hardcore initiations that really make people believe. I even feel this way a lot of the time about Christianity. I think that back in the day, if you were living in a Christian society, things like baptism and whatever rituals in your sect that you went through, whether that was like a weekly church meeting or stronger ones, whatever it is, I feel like those used to have a much bigger impact. And I could say that about all religious rituals, because now that we don't have a community reinforcing that, and now because there are things like technology and drugs and all this other stuff out there, unless you are kind of an outlier, most of the time it doesn't really feel too intense. And because not even on a religious sense, but on a societal sense, we don't have these transition points and these big moments for everyone in the community to go on to the next step, which also requires you to start acting different and doing different things. Then later on, when maybe people are going through something, they don't have any cornerstones to fall back on, except maybe just like being a child and like engaging in the act of creation. So it's actually kind of sad. And it's good that people are being playful and like getting it out. But that's what's happening in this novel. This Mary girl is just putting trinkets up and just being obsessed with her kind of estate and this kind of natural stuff going on around it. And so, of course, in one of these stories, one of the keys to a descent into madness story, if everyone in the household is getting along, then what can we do? Well, we have the villagers. And so in this story, it's the villagers, which is kind of a common theme, or the outsiders who, through their judgment, start to constrain the sisters and the household. And what's crazy is they might be right, because who poisoned their family? What the hell are these sisters doing there? Could you imagine living in a town of 200 people and everyone gets along, even in the modern world? And then one of the families, just like everyone dies at dinner from a poisoning. And then later on, 5 years later, you now have kids and their kids are like being weird and acting crazy. Wouldn't you gossip? I mean, it's not the most uncommon thing. But what I like about this novel is that Jackson never goes too deep into the characters being insane. Like throughout the book, we actually fall in love with the narrator, because many descent into madness novels or novels about madness, the characters aren't likable. Like they just like, ugh, like what's wrong with you? And so this one is awesome because madness and madness turns into something more psychic and ritualistic, something a little bit more subtle that isn't as crazy as people killing themselves in Infinite Jest or Where's Johnny? Like all that stuff. And I think that if we're talking about novels that are transformative and really kind of trying to reach out to people in the world, a novel like this speaks to more people than something like The Shining in terms of mental health and contemplating our reality, because many of us are maybe dealing with some resentment, but it's maybe not overwhelming. But almost all of us are struggling with grief, longing, trying to let go of certain deaths and hard moments in our life. And that's what this novel is about. And like I said, there's plenty of madness, there's plenty of twists and craziness, and it's not a hard read. I just pushed 3 books that are over 600 or 700 pages, Infinite Jest being 1,000 pages. And so this will be a much needed break from all these crazy novels about madness. And so, okay, so now let's contrast this with something much crazier. Everyone, we are doing it. We are talking about one of my favorite authors, William Faulkner. And I have made a ton of videos on William Faulkner if you guys are interested. I also have made a lot on Stephen King. Just go check out some of my playlists. I have dozens of videos on dozens of authors. And so if you are a fan of William Faulkner, I have at least 20 on him. And so I don't even know where to start with this novel, but I would say that the entire structure of the novel is kind of madness. Like the descent into madness is encoded in this in a literary fiction way that's genius. And what makes this novel harder to read and why people say like The Sound and the Fury is a hard read is that Faulkner doesn't describe madness. Like even the brothers Karamazov, Infinite Jest, The Shining, like there's descriptions of madness. They literally talk about it. Like, these people are crazy. And there's some of that in this novel. But this novel is like performed madness. No, there's a lot of fluff or like descriptions or like overwriting, which is fine and it makes it great in something like the brothers Karamazov or some of these more meaty books. But The Sound and the Fury cuts a lot of that and makes it this kind of Shakespearean, The Sound and the Fury, shout out Macbeth, life is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing, which is one of the harder lines in the history of literature. Like Shakespeare, everyone, like I've had a come to Jesus with Shakespeare over the past year. This past year as a teacher, I dedicated myself to Shakespeare. We read across my classes like 10 different plays. Not all in one class, but I just made every class read a different one so that I could just restudy him. And I was like, dude, holy crap, this is good. Some of the most epic right conscious rants that will never be recorded were in those classes when I'd be reading with them and be like, dude, did you see what he just did? And so this novel, somewhat like the Brothers Karamazov, has 4 distinct narratives. And so the novel separates from just the typical structure. And Faulkner does this in like As I Lie Dying and other novels. He likes to do this. And so you would think that these four narratives, eventually by the time you reach the end would amount to kind of a whole picture of what's going on, but that's not the case. Time sometimes is disruptive. Sometimes scenes just like repeat themselves. And the first chapter of this novel is probably the hardest because it's narrated by a dude named Benji, who is a mute guy with a mental handicap, if I want to say it nicely. And so one sentence may be him reminiscing about his childhood. Then the next, with no warning at all, is about him smelling grass in the present moment. And so a lot of this novel is showing on the page what madness, what even mental health issues look like in real time. And I like Faulkner because a lot of these stories taking place in the South is really cool because the South has so much grief. When you look at the Reconstruction era and obviously everything that happened with slavery, but then how society tried to move forward in the South, but basically failed, especially in like Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, and those areas. It's basically this recurring cycle. And there is a beautiful obsession with time also in this novel. Something that drives characters into madness all the time is time. The clock, I'm from Las Vegas, and when you go to the casino, the reason they have all the numbers going up and down and there are no windows on the wall and the lighting's all weird because it's hypnotic. If you unconsciously see the numbers going up and down, it literally puts you into a trance, which makes it easier maybe when you get loosened up a little bit by the hot cocktail waitress who's only hot if you've had 4 drinks to go and gamble more of your money. And so this novel is a pretty complex dive into the loss of meaning of an entire family. And then more importantly than that, the loss of control of everything, of your memory, of your life, of your status. And then eventually the narrative at times just collapses in on itself. And so Faulkner, with many of his characters, shows madness beautifully. I mean, I feel like the Southern Gothic genre, whether it's Cormac McCarthy, Flannery O'Connor, Hurston, or whoever, captures madness really well. The South, like I said, in terms of America, has had quite their fair share of odd people. And so moving forward to our next novel is The Raw Shark Text, which I have talked about probably years ago on this channel, and I occasionally mention it, but it's one of the more interesting kind of postmodern novels that's been released in the last 20 years, because I don't feel like as a whole it was necessarily successful for me. But the plot, the concept, everything related to it, outside of some small moments where I feel like there were some misexecutions, are wonderful. So this novel is about a dude named Eric Sanderson who wakes up with amnesia, and all he has are these letters from the first Eric Sanderson. And these letters are telling him that there's this conceptual shark called the Ludovidiakin or something like that eventually is going to start to hunt him. And this shark isn't going to consume his body, but rather his identity and whatever ideas that he has. And this novel really explores the concept that madness and mental health issues eventually eat away at your sense of self. That over time, maybe you find a brief moment where you get an identity, whether it's in childhood or life or in a relationship. But then as madness starts to take over, that starts to get eaten away. And that's what we say, like it eats away at you. And so there are, and I wish I could find this one right now. I'd have to go searching. Throughout the novel, there are text blocks that look like shocks. The font is distorted. All the letters and stuff start to become really odd. And this is a fun kind of postmodernist metafictional novel that explores the idea that words are dangerous, but how do you write or read about words or think at all or do anything with language if there's this conceptual shark behind you? And so I won't go too much deeper into this one. I mean, I could sit and do it, but I feel like this is a really fun introduction to postmodernism, to contemporary literature. Like I said, this novel is going to fail at times for, I think, most people. But Stephen Hall, who wrote this, was basically a beginner writer. This was the first novel he ever did. So I think it's really just the result of someone getting into writing, and any first-time novel has some bumps on the road. But absolutely love this one. And speaking of postmodernist 2000s classics, and does this kind of sound like a reoccurring theme? I know that Infinite Jest was in the 1990s, but close enough to the 2000s. But it seems like many of these new postmodernist novels, we could talk about American Psycho or like a lot of these, also the 90s, but a lot of these novels in the last 30 or 40 years are dealing with madness. Our society has been on a mental health decline. So these themes are becoming more and more relevant. And so one good thing to note and remember is that if you want to write a novel like this, you can look at novels like this, and they should be served as an inspiration for you to see what is possible. But a lot of the time, the best ideas are going to come from things like the brothers Karamazov, sticking to principles, stick to those, and then expand in your own crazy way. And then you most likely will be successful, because Infinite Jest is literally a quote from Shakespeare. If you look at a lot of these works, that's what they did. And so now you just have to do that again. That's what postmodernism mostly is. Stealing core ideas from the past and then putting your own crazy remix on it. As writing maybe a 200-page novel that isn't too dense, you can add a philosophical system into it, and there can be some things present, but that's more of your own work, and it will either sink or either float or sink because of that. So once again, we have House of Leaves. I've talked about this once before in these last group of videos, but kind of continuing, I'm seeing very similar parallels with the characters and the execution with many of these novels. So in House of Leaves, one of the main characters who isn't sane is Zampano, who is obsessed with this documentary about strange houses. And his notes are delusional and weird, and there are outbursts when you read them, and this dude isn't sane. But then another man, Johnny, who is an addict, finds Zampano's manuscript after he dies, and we follow his descent into madness with how he deals with the text. And there are other narratives that deal with houses and obsession that send people basically down into mania. And one of the reasons I really like this novel, and where I think it separates from some of the others, is that many of these characters know what is happening. They know that they are going insane. And there isn't necessarily a conceptual shark to chase them or eat them. There isn't the craziness of Infinite Jest, where Wallace will rant for 40 pages about a tennis game or something like that. But rather, many of these characters are self-aware of what's happening and decide to go into the eye of the storm. They decide that they need to do this, which I think is endearing, that they feel like sometimes because they have family members that are in a mental health institution or something, that if they abandon this and try to live on the edges, they'll never escape from this. And so they try to go into it. They try to study these houses or study these texts and try to take that courageous step, which a lot of the time it doesn't work out. But what's interesting is that at some point on almost all of these guys' journeys, they reach a point where the search for meaning can no longer, it just reaches a dead end. And what's really cool is that it's because there is an active resistance through, one could say, magical or supernatural or odd things in this novel that resist trying to have meaning made of them. And so what happens in that situations? What happens when you're going down this train of madness and what's supposed to help you individuate doesn't want you to do it? And so that's what House of Leaves explores. I would recommend it to everyone. It's kind of, like I said, one of these postmodernist Bibles that everyone should read. And once again, is one of these novels that puts you, instead of just necessarily talking about it, really makes you feel it. So next is a book more on the lighter side, something that is more in the light horror side of things, which we could probably throw The Shining and almost all these kind of into, other than maybe Infinite Jest and the brothers Karamazov. But this is A Head Full of Ghosts by Paul Tremblay, which I also read at university. So this is about another, once again, another theme seems to be coming out about this 14-year-old named Marjorie, who seems to be possessed. She's like speaking in voices. She gets ill. She like knows random things that no one's ever told anyone else. And I like it because eventually the family divides. When crazy things happen, how does the family deal with it? Like if your child has a mental illness or a mental handicap or a physical disability, how do you handle it? And I've seen people handle it in various different ways, positive and negative. But in this novel, the mom becomes obsessed with psychiatry and like trying to treat it with drugs and with the talking here. And the dad thinks that Jesus is going to heal her. And so the narration in this is interesting because the novel takes place in recollection from a blog post by her younger sister. And so the main kind of plot of this is that the parents decide to bring in this TV show called The Possession, like one of those weird shows, because they think that that may help things. But then reality TV only makes everything so much worse because producers start to manipulate things and things start to get worse because no one cares anymore about this girl who is mentally ill. And this is a huge commentary on reality TV and how that's one of the most mind-numbing things out there and one of the most maddening things in the world. I know so many people, especially young women, who use the Kardashians, the Jenners, and all these other people as reference, for what they are experiencing in life, which is crazy because like that is not the type of person that you need to be using as a referent. And so I like this because it feels very modern. It deals with modern things like blogs and reality TV, but it also has a sneaky, unreliable narrator throughout it who seemingly is also a little mentally ill. And so you get to see her sister's descent into mental illness, but you're also kind of witnessing the aftermath also. So I do recommend this one for some like fun reading. This is definitely on the more fun side, but if you're into psychological novels or just reading in general, I feel like this one isn't a bad one to put on the list. And in terms of horror fiction, even though this really isn't real horror, it is pretty well written. And I think kind of definitely goes above the genre norms and feels literary. So maybe you guys don't know, but someone who I want to continue to talk about more is Philip K. Dick. There are so many people who I haven't got the chance to talk about at length on this channel yet. And I feel like when I'm looking at the future lists I'm going to be doing, Philip K. Dick is going to be one of the very present authors on them. And so I think for this list, though, the best selection is A Scanner Darkly, which if you are still listening to this video, what did you guys think of the film? I thought it was okay, but I felt like with as good of a cast as they had, I feel like the directing or the direction in general maybe could have been better, but who knows? The runtime for this was only an hour, for the movie, I should say, was only an hour and 40 minutes, which is absolutely ridiculous. But let's talk about the novel. This is a typical kind of literary, noir novel that's based in California. This reminds me of Thomas Pynchon, James Ellroy, Walter Mosley, obviously with a different style, tone, direction. But what is it with California novels and the noir theme? Does anybody know out there? I feel like I should know this, but it feels like almost every other book I read about Los Angeles is in that style or about California in general. And so this one is a wild novel because it's about an undercover cop or agent, if we want to call him that, living with a group of addicts, but he has also become addicted to the drug called death. And the more you use the drug, the more your two brain hemispheres start to split over time. And so what makes this wild is that, and I'm not really going to spoil anything here, especially how it's written, is that because of the bureaucracy, I could call it, of the police department and the agency he's working for, they don't really know that he exists. It's almost like The Departed at some level, the movie. And it gets really trippy because eventually, as the agent starts to watch film of these addicts, he starts watching himself. But the split has gotten so great that he doesn't recognize himself. So it brings up the ultimate maddening duality. The cop and the criminal are the same person. The surveillant, becomes the surveilled. And it's not by some outside figure, but rather the person itself. And this is what's great about some of these older novels is that they really were pushing the boundaries with plot. You know, you hear people say, no idea is new, but I really do feel like authors who were functioning in like the 1940s to the 1970s had opportunities to do things for the first time. Like, because when I read them, I can't track it back to anybody. Like, we could obviously look back and find similar parallels, but I really feel like an entire genre of thinking and art stemmed just from this novel itself. Which, just to shout out Philip K. Dick, when you look at the amount of stuff that is branched off from him and his thoughts and his stories, it's wild. Not just like adaptions, just inspiration in general. He has to be in the top 10, if not in the top 5 for 20th century authors, in terms of influence. And what's crazy is that because so much new art has been created over the past, let's say, even 50 years, the influential people from, the 30s to the 70s were the template for all these other people who copied them. And so there could be people in the past, let's say in the 19th century, who were better or more innovative or whatever. But because many of the newer artists are looking at someone like a Philip K. Dick or a Nabokov in terms of literature, they'll end up being more influential than someone like a Herman Melville, who toe for toe probably was much more innovative. And so it's pretty wild that over time, this wasn't the case as much, that someone maybe 300 years before could still be really impactful. You know, Aquinas could go back and find Aristotle and Plato and reconfigure Christianity. But now, because of the amount of information that's out there, and then how that copies itself, these early progenitors like the Beatles, Elvis, or like whoever, they become even more impactful, which is kind of crazy. Bob Dylan. And so this novel is wild. It has linguistical breakdowns. It has plot twists. It has like a trippy ending. Like, it's a really good one. Like, I would recommend this one, especially if you've never read Dick before. Get into him. Like I've been saying over the past couple videos I've talked about him, I feel like he has a good 5 to 10 novels in him, because I think I've read like maybe 15, but I feel like I've enjoyed, been transformed, still think about 6 or 7. But he wrote 44 novels. And so over time, I'll have to check them out. You know, I haven't become that obsessed with them, but I'm feeling the call maybe too. Just like when I'm talking about it, he makes me excited. So once I conclude Mishima, I've basically now read through all of his novels that have been translated into English, and I'm working on rereading Dostoevsky's and Pynchon's bibliography. We may move over to Philip K. Dick over in the book club. We will have to see. And I should mention really fast that if you want another sci-fi author, controversial, L. Ron Hubbard wrote a novella named Fear that I also recommend. You can find that one easily online or wherever. And it's before L. Ron went a little cuckoo on the sauce or woke up and saw the truth forever. Let's go Scientology. One of my favorite stories about Scientology was that my high school had a bunch of Mormons at it, and I was on a cross-country team filled with Mormons. And so when we would have like the night before big races, like invitationals, we would, and if you don't know, cross-country is like long distance running, we would have a dinner at someone's house. And before we would eat the food, the Mormons would always force a prayer. They're like, everyone quiet down, we need to say a prayer. And then occasionally I'd be like, hey, why are we doing this? Like, I'm not a Mormon. And so my friend, Andy, shout out to him, said one day, guys, I've converted to Scientology. And he would sit and do a 3-minute prayer to Xenu. And when anyone snickered or laughed, he'd say, do I do this to you? And he would just go on and on about worshiping and just all this crazy Scientology stuff. It was the biggest troll ever. And hopefully it made them think like, okay, we're at an inclusive party right now with all different types of people. Do we really need to act like this? Can I just say a personal blessing in silence to myself? Anyway, so next we have a more esoteric and not as read book as everything else we've talked about. And I was introduced to The House on the Borderland by a former teacher who I used to work with in Las Vegas, Mr. West. He no longer teaches because the kids bullied him a lot. He was just this soft-spoken, big reader into science fiction, horror. He was from Ohio. He couldn't believe that kids would treat him badly and fight in class and throw things at him. And so it got so bad that homeboy went back to school for accounting at like 28, which is, quite the slog, I'm sure. I've lost contact with him, but he did show me this book when we were talking about classic novels. And so other than the brothers Karamazov, this one is probably the oldest, published in 1908. This is like a weird horror novel with supernatural cosmic elements to it. And it's kind of got haunted houses and monsters and stuff, but that's not really what the novel's about. It's really about a man slowly realizing that he's staring into a void. It's about a man that's slowly descending into madness. And so the basic premise of the story is this, that two men are in this abandoned house in the middle of nowhere, and they find this big manuscript and they start to read it. And it's basically him saying that he saw the sun obliterate, and he has to, and within his house, he starts to have to fight monsters and all this crazy stuff. But the reason I call it Ascendant to Madness is that the journal starts off somewhat normal, just going over what's going on, and then it just slowly goes off the deep end. I enjoy that it's a classic novel, that it's underread, that I like the framing of it. The writing is good. This is basically the template that H.P. Lovecraft, if you are a fan of Lovecraft, used time and time again. And so this is a canonical piece in the Descent into Madness genre. And if you are looking for something that is just totally random that you probably haven't read, because I've literally never heard of this again. Maybe once or twice I've seen it mentioned like here or there. And I'm not too deep into the sci-fi and fantasy world. I mean, I am. I've read hundreds of books in both, but in terms of like the content I listen to, I more listen to like literary fiction lectures and research stuff over there, or in philosophy, psychology. And so, what are your guys' thoughts on this one? Is this popular? Am I just acting like this isn't popular? I don't know. So thank you guys for being here. I love each and every one of you guys. Once again, here are the ways you can support me. So first, just watching through these videos supports me. Even if you give up and you're like, hey, I have to go do something and I don't want to finish, if you continue listening to me, YouTube keeps taking me seriously and sharing it out further. Obviously, liking and commenting, even if it's just like, hello, good video, always helps. Next on the list is supporting me on other social media sites, Instagram, X. Substack has their own version of social media. That is cool. I put content out over there that I do not over on YouTube. I'm really trying to get into the short form game. And then, of course, either following me on Substack and just liking what I do and looking at the free stuff, or eventually ascending to a paid subscription and supporting me that way. Any of it will work, and you just passively watching and doing nothing also matters to me, especially if you've made it this far. And so my goal is to help create a literary renaissance, and I'm going to be here every single day making these videos, waking up early, teaching children at high school how to read, how to write, and your support means everything. And so thank you guys for being here, and I'll see you in the next one.